Good evening. I'm Milton Curry, Dean of the School of Architecture at USC and the Della and Harry McDonald Dean's Chair in Architecture. And on behalf of Yolanda Daniels and the Public Events and Communications Committee and our Communications and Marketing team, I want to welcome all of you to the Spring 2021 Public Events Series here at USC Architecture. In working on my remarks for this evening's lecture, several events interrupted my train of thought, as you might imagine. At our school, we've strived to engage a diversity of lectures in a diversity of formats, highlighting the interdisciplinary nature of the intellectual terrain covered by all of our academic disciplines and programs, and emphasizing the citizen architect as an ideal and as a capacious term that demands that we reckon with the social imperatives that we as designers and design professionals must uphold as stewards of the public good, as stewards of the design environment that we all inhabit. At this moment in our nation's history, it must be said that the reckoning with class inequity, anti-Black racism, anti-immigrant sentiment, the rural-urban divide, white supremacy, and the sustenance of our democracy are not someone else's job to fix. It is our job. As architects, designers, and thinkers, we have the capacity to impact the discourse of our democracy and the physical and natural spaces of it as well. We can bring compassion and creativity to bridge ideological divides. We can articulate and implement future-focused work at the intersections of multiple, sometimes competing constituencies and polities. This is an option for how we can move forward. It's fitting that our first lecture of our series this semester introduces a new feature, our inaugural Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. annual lecture. I'm sure that if Dr. King were here with us today, he would challenge us all to do better, to do the best that we can. Dr. King was born in the 1920s and rose to prominence, having graduated from Morehouse College and through the pastorship of Ebenezer Baptist Church, where his father had been a pastor. Throughout a spectacular career as a community organizer and leader of a multifaceted civil rights movement in the U.S., largely regarded as one of, if not the most successful nonviolent movements in the history of the world, Dr. King spoke and lived with a moral clarity and a focus on justice for all persons. In his acceptance speech in Oslo, when he received the Nobel Peace Prize, King stated, and I quote, "I refuse to accept the idea that the isness of man's present nature makes him morally incapable of reaching up for the internal oughtness that forever confronts him," end quote. Our purpose tonight in the coming years with this lecture is to expose our USC community to an architect, designer, thinker whose work is future-focused and in the inclusive and progressive spirit of the teachings and writings of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The moral clarity of Dr. King's visions and the social imperatives that he and the civil rights movement outlined for us and for our democratic society were largely unrealized during his lifetime. We look to the speaker and the speakers in this series to provide commentary on how their work contributes to that long arc that is bending towards justice. Architects have been part of this arc, of all races, ethnicities, and geographies. The life of Dr. King and the challenges he faced are unfortunately still with us. Our heroic Black diaspora architects, Paul Revere Williams, Robert Kennard, J. Max Bond, Phil Freeland, David Adjaye, and so many others, trace a path in the Americas that winds from slavery to manifest destiny, to Black Reconstruction, to the Great Migration, onward to the present day. I want to read a line from a poem that caught me from Amanda Gorman's poem, The Hill We Climb. Quote, "We are striving to forge a union with purpose, to compose a country committed to all cultures, colors, characters, and conditions of man, And so we lift our gazes not to what stands between us, but what stands before us, end quote. I am so pleased to welcome Melvin L. Mitchell to be our inaugural speaker this evening. He stands before us, having practiced in Washington, D.C. for over 45 years, having been a fellow in the American Institute of Architects, a past president of the D.C. Board of Architecture, and former director of the School of Architecture and Planning at Morgan State University in Baltimore. He was a professor at the University of the District of Columbia and Howard University, and the James E. Silcock Professor of Architecture at Howard University from 2016 to 2018. His architecture degrees are from Howard University and the Harvard Graduate School of Design. I encountered Melvin's work in his first book, right here, get a copy, The Crisis of the African American Architect. Melvin is among a small group of elite senior statespersons who were at the vanguard of certain generational shifts that brought the civil rights movement onto college campuses and into architecture schools. Dealing with the paradox of academic isolation and the aspiration to make a difference in communities from which they emerged, they forged a blazing path for the rest of us to follow. Melvin, thank you for documenting what would have been forgotten histories with your first book, and congratulations on your second book that recently came out that I'm in the middle of reading. Please join me in a virtual hand clap in welcoming Melvin Mitchell to USC Architecture as our inaugural Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. lecture. It's all yours.
Thank you. Shall I go to screen share?
Sure.
I want to get to there's something in the way here. I want to get to my I want to get to PowerPoint. I can start my PowerPoint, but I'm having trouble getting to that. Where something's in
Melvin,
the way.
if you go to the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, there should be a little symbol right next to where the minus and plus are.
Yes.
If you click that symbol to the left a little bit more,
okay,
it should go into the presenter, right next to the minus. The one to the left. The button to the left of that.
oh, to this one?
Yes. Go ahead and click that, and it should go in
Oh,
presenter
okay.
mode.
All right. So I'm in my PowerPoint. So can I go ahead?
Yeah, all yours.
Okay. All right. Given my lecture title, had a chance to ponder, I need to tell you a bit about myself and the personal journey that brought me to that position today. I'll be compressing my two books comprising 200,000 words of text, notes, bibliographies, and 225 images into 5,000 words and 50 accompanying slides. I'll start by connecting the dots between Dr. Martin Luther King's final 5 years of his life that overlapped with my own first formative 5 years studying architecture at Howard in DC. And I hope to support my long-held contention that 20th century Black architects forged a strong triangulated connection between the cities of Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., and Tuskegee, Alabama. Today, many people in my age range somehow believe in their own minds that they were there on the Washington Mall that day in August 1963 with Dr. King, which would have made that the first Million Man March 32 years before one actually occurred in 1995 in DC. So let me assure you that I actually was in that crowd of over 200,000 souls that day. But in 1958, just 5 years earlier, I was taking daily walks up and down 103rd Street in Watts, Los Angeles. That time was preceded by my first decade of life growing up in the Gertown section of New Orleans near the old Charity Hospital where I was born, and remain addicted to this day to New Orleans culture, music, Mardi Gras pageantry, and signature foods. So it was from New Orleans that my mother dragged me kicking and screaming straight to the Jordan Downs Public Housing Project in Watts, where I spent the second decade of my life. On one of my daily 103rd Street walks that year, I went into a drugstore that carried the November 1958 Ebony magazine. Back then, that was Black America's version of Life magazine. An article in the magazine introduced me to, quote, 18 talented Negro architects, unquote. Among them was Norma Fairweather of New York City, that's Norma Sklarek to you, and Carrie Jenkins of Los Angeles. Ebony estimated 100 licensed Negro architects out of a nationwide total of 20,000. That's a 0.5% if you're doing the arithmetic. But then I started reading Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead masterpiece, talking about mixed messages to an 18-year-old Black kid. That same year, I met a young man named James Silcott, a Howard graduate, and who is today one of the most consequential Los Angeles architects that most of you have never heard of. When I met him and let on to him my career thoughts, he immediately tried to interest me in applying to Howard, which I only vaguely knew about. But I already had my heart set on going to USC. To jump ahead a second, by 1980, Silcott began gifting millions of dollars from his fortune earned moonlighting in Los Angeles real estate. The money was essential to ensuring the survival of the Howard architecture program. In 1958, I was aware of Paul Williams and him being the architect on the Golden State Mutual building on the corner of Western and Adams. I used any excuse to walk past the building and through the sleek lobby. In 1960, I joined the U.S. Army to get GI Bill benefits eligibility and returned to LA and go to SC. To my surprise, after basic training in California, I was shipped out to a military base in Northern Virginia, just across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. So it was inevitable that while on active duty, I would slip across the Potomac and visit the Howard campus. And after an hour on the Howard Yard in springtime, I thought I had died and gone to heaven. So my reason for being in DC and on the Mall for Dr. King's 1963 march was my new life as a deliriously happy student in Howard's Bachelor of Architecture program. I quickly learned that Paul Williams was the architect on the 100,000 square foot Howard School of Engineering and Architecture building on the left that I practically lived in over the following 5 years. During those times, this building was laying claim to being the place where nearly half of all the licensed Black architects and engineers in the US had been trained. By the way, the slide on the right is my firm's year 2010 modernization of the building. I also soon discovered that Williams' partner on the building was young Hilliard Robinson on the left, a DC native who earlier headed the Howard Architecture Department. He was also the first definitive Black modernist architect in the US. Their Williams-Robinson bicoastal partnership included major additional projects on the Howard campus, as well as the iconic Langston Terrace project, public housing project in DC. Completed in 1937, the same year Frank Lloyd Wright completed his Falling Water masterpiece. Both projects were lavishly praised that year, 1937, by the great historian sociologist Lewis Mumford and featured in a 2016 PBS special titled 10 Homes That Changed America. So we can only marvel at how we got to Pruitt-Igoes, the Pruitt-Igoes 3 decades later. I also learned at Howard that in 1907, Paul Williams was a 13-year-old Los Angeles paperboy who, in the face of being told that there was no such thing as a Negro architect, came across something in the Black national press he was delivering. Williams read about Tuskegee instructor William Sidney Pittman, who had won a federal government contract to design a large project, the Negro Building in Jamestown, Virginia. All that aside, you can imagine my state of shock and confusion in the 1965 summer of going into my third year and seeing pictures from back home, like this one on the news and on my TV, of my idyllic 103rd Street in Watts. I was also watching something with before my eyes in DC called Urban Renewal, also known as Negro Removal, unfolding in DC in the shadow of the US Capitol. I soon became the unreconstructedly Black Power militant that I remain to this day. Before I graduated from Howard, I heard from my professors about Tuskegee as the site of invention of Black architects in 1892 by our fountainhead, Robert R. Taylor. And all of that was substantiated by the 1991 doctoral dissertation of architect Richard Dozier. Also, I learned about the Tuskegee to Howard architecture education transition and the people at its center. Booker T. Washington's executive assistant, Emmett Scott, on the far left, came to DC in 1916, became Howard's secretary-treasurer in 1919. He was followed by Tuskegee people, one of them, William Hazel, who formally started the Howard architecture program that year. In 1936, Howard's first Black president, Mordecai Johnson, appointed two of them, architect Charles Cassell and landscape architect David Williston, as master planners for the Howard campus. Which brings us to Dr. King and I in the final 2 years of his life, from April 1966 to April 4th, 1968. He was not, I repeat, underline, not the revered and beloved figure in white and parts of Black America that many today assume. He was being supplanted by Stokely Carmichael, a 1964 Howard philosophy major graduate, and Floyd McKissick, a lawyer and head of the Congress of Racial Equality. Very, very different people, despite their arm in arm marching together across Mississippi in 1966. In 1967, the year I graduated, Dr. King and Carmichael each released a book alongside a third highly influential book. Except as metaphor or simile, Dr. King rarely used the word architecture, but he had a lot to say about the subject of housing. In his book, he wrote in great detail about a housing industry, using his term, that was foundational in the nation's systemic racism and relentless suppression of Black wealth creation. Carmichael's book was an angry, unyielding treatise on Black Power Now. The third book, Harold Cruz's The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, was a magisterial 500-page tome of mind-blowing historic revelations. But Floyd McKissick didn't write a book. He had a big idea about synthesizing Dr. King's and Stokely and his own differences through building a brand new city for 55,000 people on a 4,000-acre tract in the middle of the state of North Carolina. He was careful to project an integrated city image, but he left no doubt about the role that he saw Black people playing. McKissick hired New York City architects Eiffel and Johnson, and later architect planner Harvey Gantt, who earlier had sued Clemson University to gain admission before going on to an outstanding career as a practitioner and eventual mayor of Charlotte, North Carolina. McKissick's city building role model was development magnate James Rouse, who was planning the new 100,000 person city of Columbia, Maryland, midpoint between Baltimore and DC. Rouse's chief planner, Mort Hoppenfeld, was one of my instructors during my student days at Howard. 30 years on, Columbia would look in actuality pretty much like the 1968 architecture model you see there, while McKissick's dream of a soul city still had not advanced beyond 100 families, several small businesses, and of course, a Baptist church. After Dr. King's 1968 death, I continued my Max Bond modeled Black power rabble rousing in a rapidly decombusting DC over the next couple of years, and then took an 18-month time out in Boston, returning to DC. By 1972, I'm a newly licensed architect and assistant professor at Howard. In 1977, I hung out my shingle and with my former classmates quickly found my niche in affordable multifamily housing. But that year, 77, I also circled back to my LA roots through a formal hookup with LA architect Carrie Jenkins, the one in that 1958 Ebony article. His firm had just completed the first new Martin Luther King Jr. hospital, located just a few doors from a little house I bought my mother. Over the following 3 years, I was regularly flying back and forth between LA and DC. In 1979, DC Mayor Marion Barry, who just a decade earlier was a dashiki-wearing Black Power militant, was greeted at his inauguration by 24 Black-owned architectural firms, nearly all of them Howard graduates. Barry, like Tom Bradley in LA, Coleman Young in Detroit, Harold Washington in Chicago, and a host of other Black big city mayors, all did well by Black architects. Nearly 2 event-filled decades flew by to 1997 when I began writing my first book, The Crisis of the African-American Architect. I was trying to understand the world through the prism of my North Star, Harold Crews. Any similarities you see between my book title and Crews's book is purely intentional. The late 1980s through early 1990s were Black architects' high watermark before the full crushing impact of the Reagan-Gingrich Revolution kicked in. Between 1997 and 2002, I was Director Dean of the Morgan State University School of Architecture in Baltimore. With no undergraduate component, the school consisted of graduate degree programs in architecture, landscape architecture, and city planning. Some labeled it as a miniature version of the Harvard Graduate School of Design that had been created 2 decades earlier by my classmate, Harry Robinson, who was at Morgan then. His HGSD model was fine by me. I had already become enamored with the notion of the need for a medical law school curriculum structure at the HBCU-based programs. During that same 5-year period, I also completed an all-modular constructed 110-home subdivision project in DC. As the at-risk developer, architect, and builder, and through generous city subsidies, I sold all of the homes to low, moderate income first-time home buyers. 10 years later, those completed homes were appraising at 3 times the buyer's purchase price. Many things were accomplished by those families out of that increased equity. In 2004, I joined NOMA and launched a quarterly color photo magazine. The inaugural spring issue featured articles on young Phil Freelon and the revered Max Bond. I saw both of them as excellent prospects for designing the long-awaited National Museum of African American History project that was starting to look like it could actually become a reality. That NOMA magazine issue saluted the Black Museums movement that started a decade earlier with the Charles Wright Museum in Detroit on the left, followed by the Underground Freedom Railroad Center in the middle in Cincinnati, designed by a Howard classmate, Walter Blackburn, and Freelon's Reginald Lewis Museum that was under construction in Baltimore. I also wrote a short cryptic article in that issue titled, "Who is David Adjaye?" 4 years later, 2008, the 3 men would meet in a New York City coffee house and agree to join forces to pursue the museum commission. But by the fall 2004 issue, I had pivoted to urban housing and my continuing dismay at the lack of significant interest in it. The feature article was on Kansas City and Atlanta-based architect Charles McAfee, then considered by some as a credible challenger to Max Bond as the Dean of America's Black Architects. McAfee, along with his 2 architect daughters, was presiding over a busy conventional practice. But I had learned that in 1994, a decade earlier, he founded an inner city modular housing manufacturing plant in his Wichita, Kansas hometown. I wanted to see more of that. In 2005, I was asked in a phone call by a young woman writer, to opine on who I thought were the 10 most respected Black architects in the nation. She was writing an article for the coming October 2005 issue of Ebony magazine. Her article went with the first 7 names I offered: Kurt Moody, Charles McAfee, Wendell Campbell of Chicago, Allison Williams of Perkins and Will, Jack Travis of New York, and leading proponent of a Black design aesthetic, Phil Freelon and Max Bond. The writer passed on my last 3 academics, former Howard Dean Harry Robinson and the University of Washington's incomparable Dr. Sharon Sutton, and Kirk Seitz, a serious Cornell-trained practitioner who had turned big-time commercial real estate developer. So, by mid-year 2016, I consider myself to be in the closing phase of my over half-century-long dual career as an affordable housing-centered practitioner who at one time or other had held leadership roles at 3 of the nation's 7 HBCUs. By September of 2018, I had just completed a 2-year appointment at Howard as Silcott Endowed Chair Professor. You met Silcott earlier on slide 3. Along with Harry Robinson and several other retiring architecture professors, we were witnessing a leadership transition to Dr. Hazel Edwards, the woman in the light blue dress, a consequential scholar, urban designer, and the first female leader in the entire storied century-old history of the Howard program. That same year, I began writing my second book. 3 recently reread books were driving that decision: Cruz, of course, Roger Lewis's seminal book, Architect, and Carter Weissman's sweeping cultural history, Shaping a Nation. In my book, the part 3 conclusion was devoted to my alarm about the raging national housing crisis that was posing an existential threat to Black America's prospects for maintaining political, cultural, and economic viability in America's cities and inner suburbs. I called for a new Black-controlled national affordable housing industry, something first broached in 1948 by national Black leadership. I was also, in writing the book, I was also haunted by my nagging thoughts about, we wanted to express what a disaster I thought it would have been had the museum jury selected any one of the other 5 finalists' proposals and teams. That's a book, I suppose. Since the 2016 opening of the museum on the National Mall, African American architects, as the marquee 2% among 24 allied 2% entities, have been experiencing a heightened level of attention throughout Black America. I opined that they could parlay that attention into the achievement of something that many actually aspire to, namely the elevation of Black architects to a place of essentiality in Black American eyes that rivals Black medical doctors and lawyers. In chapter 2 of my book, titled African Americans in Current Practice, a reprise of the 1991 Jack Travis book, Revisited, and the other titled Four Firms, Three Canaries and a Unicorn. I visited the 2,000 Black-owned firms profiled that year by Travis in his seminal book. These firms represented 10% of the nation's 240 Black-owned practices, an estimated 900 Black licensed architects. Interestingly, today, 30 years later, there are nearly 2,500 Black licensed architects, but less than 120 Black-owned practices. Many were the proverbial canaries in the coal mine. Travis missed Moody Nolan, then a decade old, and standing all alone today as the Unicorn, a one-of-a-kind firm that was named as the AIA 2020 Firm of the Year. I have my theories about how Kurt Moody did that, and that too is maybe a book. Missing was Bryant and Bryant, the firm I own now, and at that time laying claim to being the largest Black-owned architecture firm in the nation. Travis also missed the then only a year old Freelon Group, and see how that turned out. Devereaux and Purnell and 2/3 of the 24 firms profiled by Travis are mostly gone, despite, like Devereaux and Purnell in this slide, all having really, really splendid, wonderful bodies of built works. So I admonished that we do something rarely done by Black architects. That is, stop reading architect-written manifestos and instead read the last several years of former New Orleans Mayor Mark Morial's National Urban League annual State of Black America reports and the grim picture of the socioeconomic and financial health of Black America in comparison to the nation's other major competing ethnic groups, and also to pay special attention to housing legislation crafted by Representative Gwen Moore, Senator Elizabeth Warren, and Representative Cedric Richmond. The new affordable housing industry that I called for must utilize all available and emerging tools and resources, some hidden in plain sight. Just months ago, such progressive-oriented national legislation along with the Green New Deal, were all thought to be merely radical leftist pipe dreams. I opined that the politics were falling in place for a Black controlled affordable housing industry able to dominate Black America's spaces. Such an entity could and must now seriously compete with the currently virtually all white owned affordable housing industry. I wrote at some length about 3 big Black wealth creation ideas since 1966. In addition to the Soul City idea that we talked about, there were 2 others. The second, a new town in town, began in DC in the late 1960s. Theodore Higgins Jr., a Howard University Engineering School graduate, developed a 360-acre project comprising 4,000 homes and apartment units, a sizable shopping mall, 2 public schools, ample open space, and recreational facilities. The population is majority African American with a sprinkling of whites and other. Conditions and circumstances today are ripe for the replication of the Fort Lincoln Newtown vision in many other locations over the coming decade. The third of the 3 big past Black wealth creation initiatives is simply known as Buy the Block. First popularized in 2013 by Cincinnati entrepreneur Lynn Smith, it's now a full-blown movement. The late Nipsey Hussle in South Central LA is a grassroots example. A more recent iteration is that of 2 phenomenally successful African-American developers, Washington, D.C. born and bred Donahoe pupils and Victor McFarland, who are developing the Angels Flight project in downtown LA. Each has launched a $500 million fund that is providing equity capital to minority-owned real estate developers whose focus is on affordability and workforce housing. The Buy the Block movement is growing exponentially and can surpass the 1980s architect-led New Urbanism movement as a national organizational force of creating Black wealth and equity. So, in my search for suitable 21st century development systems for an apostate wing of Black architects, I found market disruptors like Katerra and Factory SO to be business models worthy of emulation, even though at lesser scales. So in my closing chapter in a section titled The Diaspora Space Revisited, I saw encouraging sights on my first trip to Accra, Ghana 20 years ago. And on my more recent trips, I'm seeing many of those things bearing fruit, just as I saw in the site that you're watching on the screen there. One of the examples is this 40-person firm founded and staffed by mostly childbearing women architects and allied disciplines. I saw similarly inspiring sites in Johannesburg, Pretoria, and Durban in the Republic of South Africa. And just 225 miles up the coast from Accra and Abidjan is a busy architecture firm headed by Paris-trained Guillaume Coffey and Yale-trained Issa Diabate, who interestingly interned in the DC office of the old Devereux and Purnell firm. Diabate is also determined to build the first school of architecture in his 25 million person nation. So my point here is these savvy intercontinental continental African architectural firms have much to offer their African American counterparts. So I'm going to end with these few postscript thoughts. Since last year's publication of my book, I followed up with 2 op-ed articles published in ArcaNet. The first build something big, 1 million new affordable housing units, 2020 to 2030. And the second, Black medical doctors, lawyers, and architects. Those are two recurring themes that are at the core of my thinking about which way forward. And the third recurring theme, the role of the HBCUs, is crystallizing. In short, an apostate wing of Black architects must fanatically prioritize housing and community development on a 21st century holistic approach, particularly, though certainly not exclusively, in the nation's Black spaces, where we are virtually invisible and where white developers and architects give no quarters and show no mercy. Unfortunately, some of this Black architect pain is self-inflicted. In my book, I have alluded to the Black architect's rarely voiced hope that Black America, and particularly Black youth, come to see my profession as not just prestigious, but equally essential as they see the medical and legal professions. Black America and Black youth hold understandably pragmatic views about the subject of money. That is a reality that cannot be wished away. On looking at lists labeled as the 25 most desirable paying jobs in Black America, and often conflated with lists of desirable businesses to start, they notice that medical doctors are on the top, lawyers are on the list, well up on the list, and architects do not make the list. For clues to Black America's perceptions about the three professions, let's again remind ourselves that the National Medical Association was founded in 1895. Their declared mission back then remains intact to this day. Simply stated, it is the elimination of the health disparities of Black Americans. Just 30 years later, the National Bar Association was founded. There were then over 1,000 Black lawyers in the US, thanks mainly to the 1869 founding of a law school at Howard. The Black lawyers' mission was also clear and compelling. In contrast, Black architects did not establish their own professional fraternal organization, the National Organization of Minority Architects, until 1971, 76 years after the founding of the National Medical Association by Black doctors, and 61 years after the founding of the NBA by Black lawyers. Regrettably, Black architects constrained their mission to alignment with the anodyne gentleman architect mission of the American Institute of Architects. Had that mission mirrored that of the medical doctor, only a single word needed changing: wealth in lieu of health. Again, clarity of mission and educational curriculum structure emerge as key issues. In closing, I hasten to add that I do not challenge the current mission and structure of today's rejuvenated NOMA. The vitally important role and impact of NOMA's women's leadership in the profession is palpable. I applaud the fabulous outgoing young NOMA president, Kim Dowdell, and her two incoming presidential successors, Jason Pugh and the equally promising young Pascal Sablan. They all call for a doubling of the current number of 2,500 Black licensed architects to 5,000 over the next decade. Similarly, I acknowledge today's 170 accredited first professional degree architecture programs as having a continuing responsibility and role in educating Black architects over the coming decade. However, NOMA's call for doubling the number of Black architects is necessary but not sufficient. Desperately needed is an additional 1,000 or more apostate licensed architects whose 21st century redefinition, if an honest and relevant one, would be people who design and produce houses, housing, and communities. Which brings us back to my lecture title and conclusion. The apostate architect wing's first order of business must be the establishment of new educational institutions and curricula, at least a dozen, and each of the big city standard metropolitan statistical areas highlighted on this map. Former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg recently gave $1 billion to today's 4 HBCU medical schools toward the cause of increasing the number of Black MDs. We must find Bloomberg counterparts who are prepared to provide at least a fraction of the Bloomberg money to seed fund a dozen academic entities essential to produce an apostate wing of Black architects. Our challenge is to make the case that those dozen new and or restructured schools will focus laser-like on the needs of an African-American dominated housing industry that charges itself with producing 1 or 2 million affordable housing units over the next decade. The string of zeros in the dollar cost of the number of housing units that will be built in all of Black America's spaces over the next decade is an insanely long one. Currently, the percentage of those dollar costs that will be captured and circulated in those spaces and amongst Black America's 2% and under collection of allied built environment professions, including financial institutions, is a statistical zero. To substantively change that predicament requires new paradigms, arrangements, relationships, and educational institutions are a key piece of the new equation. In addition to all of the Black wealth building advocacy and initiatives by the dozen new schools, each of the nation's 200 largest SMSAs should be the site of at least one DC Fort Lincoln new town as a Greenwood Wall Street new town in town model. At least a dozen SMSAs should be sites of new cities of 100,000 people or more. So to conclude, I do not speak for or represent anybody but myself in thinking that the Los Angeles SMSA, along with the greater DC, Baltimore, and the New Orleans SMSAs, should be the 3 top priority locations for the launching of a dozen new fully networked medical, law school curriculum structured architecture schools across the nation. Each of those 3 SMSAs, along with the other 9 on my map, have an outstanding cluster of accredited architecture schools. They are all rooted in the orthodoxies of aesthetics and self-referential scholarly research, as well they should and must. None of their presences preclude the need for new apostate schools as cultural and community town hall bastions in the HBCU mode. Structured and mission to align with the wealth creating agendas of their respective African-American communities. Here in the greater DC Baltimore SMSA, I have been informally advising the Morgan State University School of Architecture and Planning Dean, Mary Ann Akers, who is the second dean's successor after my earlier years of leadership in that position. Dr. Akers is committed to making her school a national model in the production of licensed African-American architects through the combined tools of integrated paths to accelerated licensure, community design center clinics, and a 21st century integrated and focused approach to affordable housing and sustainability for African-American dominated communities, as well as integrated communities across her school's SMSA. I believe this puts Dr. Akers squarely in line with the still not yet realized dreams and ideals espoused by Dr. King over 50 years ago, and that I believe he would be advocating today on the housing industry front. a close, let's see, I want to go to another slide here. Next. A close to your home case in point is the Crenshaw Baldwin Hills Plaza. The LA City Council approved master plan by the local architecture firm Raw International, headed by Roland Wiley. I hope you can see his picture behind it's on the screen there. Allows for several thousand new housing units in addition to 1 million square foot of commercial space. Another local Los Angeles architecture firm, Base Architecture, headed by SciArc grad Michael Anderson, is well along in Michael's game-changing plan to tap Senator Elizabeth Warren's 10-year $500 billion, with a B that is, or maybe that's $500 billion, excuse me, legislative act to create tens of thousands of new multi-family home ownership units in Greater Crenshaw and beyond. Anderson will be soon releasing a book tentatively titled Creating Black Urban Wealth, Leveraging Capital in Black Communities Through Real Estate Development. Wiley and Anderson are the respective heads of the two most significant Black-owned practices in LA, but alas, their respective MOs, Black wealth creation priorities, and philosophical viewpoints are not being operationally proselytized or valorized in today's architecture schools. I firmly believe that either or both of them would be as justified as was the late, great Ray Cappy 50 years ago in his founding a new architecture school dedicated to preparing a new wing of apostate architects in the realm of design experimentation. Now, again, I hasten to add that what Ray Cappy did in founding SciArc may be the farthest thing from Wiley or Anderson's mind, but in LA, as well as the other 11 locations on my slide map, this is what must be done. So I'm going to end on this observation. The slide on the left, January 6th in DC, is not as much about white supremacy as it is about a growing white inferiority complex, a dread of not being able to compete in a world of level playing fields. And on the right, what's on the right speaks for itself insofar as the role of HBCUs in our immediate future. So, coming full circle a half century after Dr. King's death, I still deeply cherish his dreams and ideals, and Stokely Carmichael for his courage and passionate commitment to Black agency. But I resonate most with the civil rights lawyer activist Floyd McKissick and his wish for a multiracial society, his belief in a Harold Crusian Black agency framework, and most of all, his belief in the need for building big as he aspired to in 1967 in his Soul City project. And with that, I'm open to questions and reactions about my conclusion about the way forward. Thank
you so much, Melvin. Quite a lot to digest.
Okay.
Not surprising. I'm going to ask a first question, which will be maybe a framing for some other questions that I'll get to in the Q&A. Also ask people to put questions into the Q&A, and we'll ask as they come up. That'd be great. And then Esmeralda, who's a student, will also help me in this process as well. I want to start by, first of all, thank you for a very comprehensive and I think accessible lecture and a way into kind of the role that Black architects have played and can play. I want to ask maybe a foundational question that has to do with capitalism itself and whether I'm not sure, are you cynical of the structural role of capitalism in a way defining the options that have been or are available in Black America, in terms of developing housing, in terms of retaining communities against the waves of gentrification. How do you square the kind of optimism for return to kind of community-based activity in the Black community and kind of strengthening that community physically with the brutal force of capitalism, which is the driving force behind so much of the dissipation of Black communities, whether it be gentrification or whether it be just the lack of wealth creation amongst that group as well.
Okay, first of all, I am to the left of Bernie and AOC in the sense that I fully expect, not to see, but expect there will be something that looks like what they're advocating in the by and by. That's inevitable. It's the logical place where advanced, mature capitalism is going to go. A Scandinavian type of situation, a mixed economy. But in such a situation, when that happens, it's still going to be a mixed economy with a robust private market sector. It's just that it, of course, has the welfare state as well as the regulatory state. And I think all of that is ultimately where the US must go. So, but in the meantime, as we await Valhalla, I say we cannot unilaterally disarm. So that's where I am. I mean, you get my drift? That's where I am insofar as where we're going and how we're going to get there. We can't be the one that, I mean, we all know, the tragedy of housing having been turned into a commodity and the havoc that wrecks. We all know and understand all those things. But those are realities that we're going to have to grapple with, and we're going to have to get control of that monster and tame it to our use and our benefit and that of our people and our communities.
Thanks. I'm going to take a question from the chat here. How do you feel about Monica Ponce-Leon's, the Dean of Architecture at Princeton, call for a radical transformation of the processes and standards for architectural licensure, and what would transformation of architectural education and licensure look like to you?
Well, first of all, I'm a huge fan of Monica, and I've been following all of the things she's talking about. I think she is definitely on the right track. It's just a matter of how that's going to unfold. What I particularly resonate with her about is implied or not, and that is this business of architectural education being tied into and dependent upon and being a training ground or a place for cheap labor. We've got to figure out a way to sever that bond. And I think that's one of the things that she's talking about. And I'm totally on board with that. And in fact, that's one of the things I'm advocating now in terms of a model, and why I'm so big on the whole concept of IPAL, or integrated path to licensure. That is to say, people finishing architecture and not having to be dependent upon becoming labor usually cheap labor. They can take their business plan and go right to what they need to do.
There's another couple of questions that relate to, you talked a lot about architectural history of Black architects and practice, and have talked about an aversion in some ways to concentrating on this aesthetic interpretation of architecture. I'm quoting a Charles Davis in the question room here. You seem to have an aversion to concentrating on an aesthetic interpretation of architecture that elides our gaze upon Black ownership and serving Black communities. He would like to hear more about, to hear you say more about social and spatial patterns that you became aware of by creating housing for Black communities. And I'm going to join that with another question about, the role of architectural theory and the role of that. How does that play into rethinking practice?
Well, as best as I could hear you and understand you, the big fight right now that I'm waging and trying to instigate is gaining more control of the production aspects of housing production. I worry less about the aesthetics. I just think that that's an errand or a road that I'm leery of. Theory, well, let's just say I'm really thankful for the people and the schools that have the resources and the wherewithal to be able to give proper homage, pay proper attention to a robust exploration of theory, and that's basically where I am. It just obviously I'm prioritizing something different. I'm prioritizing 21st century practice, and I am looking to the academy to take care of and to handle the issue of theory.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions from student's perspective of I think about what mix of professional experience in current architecture, what should architecture students be taking as courses or classes in architecture school? And also, do you recommend that architecture students, be engaged in real estate and urban economics and/or community-centered design practice within their architecture schools? And is that part of the core of what you see in these new schools developing?
Well, the biggest issue so far as school and students is and what they should be doing or taking is that I'd like to see more of an emphasis on undergraduates being more devoted to a broader range of things and subject and issues, especially reading, writing, counting, and critical thinking, and deferring some of the more technical aspects of architecture and the design process to the graduate level. Now, having said that, and recognizing that the reality that students are in school and are doing things, they've got to basically think about where they want to be 5 to 10 years from now, and really get a handle on that. And I believe that can give them some clues and understandings about what they should be doing, what courses they should be taking, because everything is just all so fleeting and transitory now. So you know that's my take on how they've got to get a handle on that issue.
I'm going to ask Esmeralda to ask the next question too.
Hi,
Yes.
Melvin. I had a question regarding gentrification and just pushing back against the forces of gentrification. I was wondering how you would recommend us as architects help push against that, specifically in predominantly Black and Latinx communities.
Well, here again, as architects, because that's a political and a sociological and an economic issue and question. Uh, so as architects, uh, you're I don't want to use the word constrained, but let's just say you've got to basically come at that from within the framework of the community's dynamic when it comes to you know their own mechanisms for combating those things. In other words, I have great difficulty seeing it as an architectural issue so much. That's probably not a very satisfying thing to hear, but as I get on up in age here, I got to tell you what the real deal is.
You have another question as well?
Sure, I'll ask one from the Q&A. Okay, so there is a question regarding your thoughts on what an integrated medical law and architecture curriculum would look like.
Well, I use the medical law in terms of the fact that, first of all, you know, one of the things we all talk a lot about is that architects, we're only 2% of, you know, and I look at and how difficult it is to get people interested in it, I suppose. But I look at medicine and law. Those percentages are 2.5 times what ours is, and there's a reason for that. How the curriculums are structured. You know, what you got to do to really prepare and qualify, and I just think that that is a model, a working model, curriculum-wise, structure-wise, that needs to be paid more attention to. So I mean, it's not about taking anything in, you know, matter of health courses or anything like that. It's all about you before you start architecture. Let's learn how to read, write, count, think critically, do all sorts of things. I just have a problem with jumping feet first into architecture and studio while we're still grappling with you know, coming out of puberty. I mean, it's just, you know, I just think some growing up needs to take place.
I'm going to ask a question myself, then I'll ask one from the chat. But
Sure.
you know, there's a whole constellation of how you can become an architect or go through architecture school. There's community colleges. We have a vast community college system in California. We have many transfer students who come out of that system. There's the 4-year degree, which some of which are 2+2, kind of 2 years liberal arts, 2 years architecture. There's a 5-year BArch, of course, the master's and then post-professional. In that constellation, kind of where do you see, I mean, starting an architecture school seems daunting to me, running one that's already up and running and having, you know, the headaches that
Right.
I have
Right.
doing that. Just, you know, it explodes, my mind explodes on the thought of building something new. But having said that, where do your new schools, the idea of them sit within the context of existing HBCUs, and then also schools like ours, which are very proud of the fact that we have diversity. We're very diverse, more diverse than our peers, and feel very strongly that you know, we can be a school that has you know,
Yeah.
a lot of the values that you're talking about. So where do we sit? Where does Harvard sit? Where you and I went in this whole
Well,
process?
here again, I'm the schools I'm talking about, the restructuring or whatever. First and foremost, it doesn't really necessarily involve anything at the undergraduate level. I'm talking strictly about graduate programs.
Okay. So these new schools will be only graduate.
Right. We want to pull from the same source, the same source, the same body as do the law schools and the medical schools, undergraduates. That's the distinction. I leave everything else to the 170 other programs, including USC. We mentioned Harvard. Now, that's really the model, so to speak, with some tweaks that I'm talking about. In effect, when I got to Morgan, that's what was there. Three and a half year, well, a 3.5 year architecture program. And not only did it work there, but I mean, obviously it worked at Harvard, but it worked there. So that's where my head is when I talk about schools, new schools.
Last question, and I'll try to merge as many as I can here. How would you incorporate land use policies in the study and practice of architecture? And just getting back to Black-owned firms, Lance Collins, who's head of the NOMA chapter here, SoCal NOMA.
Yeah, I know
Lance.
Lance.
Former student, is asking, how do you deal with this? The number that you gave us, which intuitively I knew that this was happening with consolidation in our industry, but the number that you gave us of 120 Black-owned firms, 2,500 Black architects, and the narrowing down of Black-owned firms,
right,
versus what it used to be, even with less total number of architects.
Right.
How do you see that resurgence coming back? Is it through a blended firm, like you mentioned, where people are working both as developers and architects? Is that the way back to a robust ownership model?
I think it's more along the lines of the way back for practice has got to be practices that don't deal with the silos, practices that are wholly integrated insofar as the business of production, of getting something done, getting something built. So we're not reinventing the wheel there. There are plenty of models out there of people who are doing that. And it also has a nonprofit component to it that can also be looked at.
There's something like Mass Architects.
I was thinking about a firm out there whose name is escaping me, but they are the in-house studio of a nonprofit developer.
Got it.
So that's a model, but obviously that means there's got to be a beefing up and more attention to the whole issue of development itself. And so the role and relationship of architects to that.
Well, our time has flown by. Again, my sincere apologies that you're not in person with us in LA.
You're lucky to be there.
We'd like to get you here as soon as possible because we want to continue this conversation with you. And we appreciate so much the time and effort you put into the talk and being our inaugural MLK Junior annual lecture. It means a lot to me and to us as well. So thank you so much for giving us a great evening and a great start to our lecture series.
Thoroughly enjoyed the opportunity that you gave me here, this platform. Thoroughly appreciate it. Okay.
And
So
we'll see you.
let's see. That it? Am I out, or
That's it.
are you going to make me
Press
disappear?
leave, and then we all disappear.
Okay. All right.
But we'll see you. You have to press another button to get into the other session.
Oh, that's right. I'm supposed to come back at these.
5
Okay.
minutes or so. Yeah.
All right.
Thank you, everybody, and stay tuned. Come to our Wednesday lecture series moving forward. Thank you.